Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says he welcomes a proposed limited ceasefire with Russia, but needs to see more details. Zelenskyy says he's open to pausing attacks on energy infrastructure if Russia does the same. His comments follow a phone call between U.S. President Donald Trump and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin on Tuesday. Now, despite those talks, air raid sirens sounded in the Ukrainian capital on Tuesday night with reports of Russian attacks on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. President Zelenskyy accuses Russia of trying to drag out the war. Putin has so far rejected Washington's push for a full 30-day ceasefire, insisting that any long-term deal would be contingent on the West halting all military aid for Ukraine. But in a Fox News interview after his call with the Russian leader, U.S. President Donald Trump denied reports that Putin had demanded an end to foreign aid as a condition for a ceasefire.
I think we had a great call. It lasted almost 2 hours. Talked about a lot of things, and toward getting it to peace. And we didn't talk about aid, actually. We didn't talk about aid at all. We talked about a lot of things, but aid was never discussed.
For more on this, we're joined now by DW's Nick Connolly in Kyiv and Yuri Rushetto in Riga, where our Moscow team has been based since DW was banned from reporting in Russia. Yuri, let's start with you. Trump there is seeming very pleased with his phone call with Vladimir Putin, but what concessions has he actually convinced Putin to make?
The only concession Putin made was that Russia agreed to Trump's proposal to refrain from shelling Ukrainian energy infrastructure for 30 days, meaning no more missiles would be fired at Ukrainian power plants, heat supply stations, refineries and similar facilities. But that's all. Essentially, this is the minimal concession, because the Russians would then, or could then, shell everything else. And as important as the heating stations are, the heating season is almost over, and the Ukrainians have proven time and again in the past that the Russians couldn't truly disable the Ukrainian network despite massive shelling. Then there is agreement on a prisoner exchange, but that's nothing new. Such exchanges happened all the time. The essential thing, a complete ceasefire, hasn't been achieved.
Nick, you're in Kyiv. Is there any sense in Ukraine that this call has brought a ceasefire any closer?
I think there's great skepticism. We heard those air raid sirens just a few minutes ago in the show, and that was the case here in Kyiv when people were looking at their phones trying to make out what exactly Trump and Putin had spoken about. They heard Russian drones once again flying over the city, attempts to shoot them down. I think there is a real fear here that basically Putin is imitating a process, some kind of negotiation process that's going to basically suck Trump in, but also allow Western countries to basically take their foot off the accelerator and not do as much to reinforce Ukraine's army as they should be doing, especially now that American aid is a lot less reliable. And that then when these negotiations at some point run into a wall, end without any result, then Ukraine will be in a weaker position than it is right now. I think it is just about the blame game right now. Putin doesn't want to give anything to Trump, but he doesn't want to say it outright, and that's why we have this answer. As Yuri said, the heating season is almost over, and also Ukraine is doing significant damage to Russia's oil and gas sector with its drone attacks on Russian facilities. So it's also something that Putin would want for himself and his own economy.
Yuri, Russia resumed strikes immediately after that conversation Putin had with Donald Trump. Is this his way of asserting his position ahead of further negotiations?
I think so, yes. The Russians don't accept weakness. The Russians accept strength, and they want to demonstrate this strength. Currently, the Russians are advancing in Ukraine, and they will continue to advance to gain as much territory as possible. Look, Putin wants to gain time. Nick said it. He plays a game, creates effects, special effects on the front. Putin knows that one day it could be a question of territories that Ukraine might have to give up to Russia in order to reach a peace agreement. There has been more and more talk on this recently.
Nick, Russia is tying a ceasefire to huge conditions like the suspension of foreign aid. Has Ukraine had any of its demands met so far?
I think that has basically all been postponed, right? This first Trump-Putin call over in terms of a ceasefire has not moved things significantly further. I think that is all left for the future. We've heard the red lines from the Ukrainian side. That is, Ukraine will not agree to some kind of neutral status. It won't agree to reducing its army and leaving itself vulnerable to renewed Russian attack. That's something we've been hearing a lot out of Moscow, that they want to see the Ukrainian army reduced basically to pre-war levels. And it will also not recognize Russian control over Crimea or any other occupied territory. What it can do is it can say, okay, we'll leave those territories that are currently controlled by Russia to future negotiation. We won't try and take them back by force for now. That is something for the future. That is, I think, the only compromise that works politically inside Ukraine. But I think we're just not there yet. And I think there's a sense here in Ukraine that Trump wasn't listening to the Ukrainians when they said to him, Putin still wants to get everything he wanted in 2022. And now they're basically having to let Trump make his own mistakes, see that his diplomatic talents aren't going to get any new concessions from Putin. And then hopefully sometime down the road, when Trump has realized that his current track isn't working, then they can come to some kind of better consolidated negotiating position between Kyiv and Washington and really put the pressure on Vladimir Putin to actually come to a deal that Ukraine can live with.
Yuri, talks in Saudi Arabia between the U.S. and Russia are to resume on Sunday. The White House is still set to continue pushing for a full ceasefire. How far apart are Russia and Ukraine on this right now?
Well, they are very far apart. I think, in general, Putin is less interested in stopping the fighting in Ukraine and more interested in stopping US aid to Ukraine, first and foremost. It's quite remarkable that Trump explicitly denied that this issue was on the agenda. The Kremlin story is quite different, Nicole. A statement released by the Kremlin after the talks claimed that Putin had demanded a complete stop to military aid as a key condition for the start of a peace settlement. Putin clearly sees himself as the winner at the moment, not only militarily, but also diplomatically. And this puts Russia very far apart from Ukraine, I would say, for the negotiations in Saudi Arabia in the next days.
Nick, how much of a feeling is there that the U.S. is really acting in Ukraine's best interest in these negotiations?
Well, that's the thing, Nicole, right? We were in a situation just a couple of months ago under Biden in the White House that the US was a de facto ally of Ukraine's. Now, the question is Trump just a mediator as he claims to be, or is he actually a Russian ally? We've certainly seen him putting a lot less pressure on the Russians for now than the Ukrainian side. You'll remember the kind of extraordinary pressure put on Zelenskyy to agree to a full-scale ceasefire, and now Putin offers him basically nothing and gets a lot of praise from Donald Trump. So there's a real worry, but I think for now the Ukrainians are going to keep quiet. There's a lot of pressure on them from Paris and London to basically give a lot of praise to Trump in public, to not call him out as Zelenskyy did with pretty dire results recently, and to basically look what Trump actually does rather than what Trump says, hope that he actually ends up supporting the Ukraine position more than he does in terms of the kind of rhetorical level, and then also just give the Europeans some time to prepare their offers here. We've got Keir Starmer talking about peacekeepers, the French also involved in that, so there's a real hope now that they can win some time and allow Europe to do more in a situation where Trump obviously wants to get out of this as quickly as possible.
Nick Connolly in Kyiv and Yuri Rochedo in Riga, thank you both so much for your time.